Welcome, everybody, to our first Dance to the Music of Time 2025 reading group discussion. It's terrific to see so many people show up. I'm Brad Bigelow. I have been hosting kind of virtual international reading groups for about 4 years now, and I find it's a really great way to share the experience of a book through discussion and also to open it up to an international audience and get a variety of perspectives. And it's an activity, it lends itself to these kind of longer project books like A Dance to the Music of Time. So I will start with a little bit of introduction about how this works, or at least how these things have I've run these things in the past, and a little bit about the dance if you're coming to it new. I'm sure many of you are. It's a familiar text, but the idea is we have folks who are first-time readers and probably people who are might be eighth, ninth, 10th time readers. So I want to just start by sharing a little presentation with, I hope, some useful information. So welcome again to this discussion group. This month we'll be talking about the first volume, A Question of Upbringing. I think you're all here because you subscribe to the mailing list that's available on the site musicoftime.com. That site is not a comprehensive guide to Anthony Powell's book, and so primarily this is going to be used for this hosting the mailing list. It provides on the homepage, you'll see the dates and times of the Zoom discussions. They're going to be consistently on the first Mondays of the month. And the nice thing is it turns out that that timing avoids all these confusions of different time zone changes or time changes between the US and the UK and Europe. I'll also include links to the monthly YouTube recordings, provide an introduction. It's a personal introduction to each volume. Hopefully, it just kind of helps you get your teeth into it. I also post around the middle of the month a selection from some of the contemporary reviews because I find that fascinating to see how the reception kind of evolves over the course of times. Particularly if you look at, as you'll see with some of the later volumes, it's not at all unusual to have reviewers in the later volumes say, well, actually, I haven't read anything else in the series, but this is what I think of this particular novel. And then some on the side, there's some links to useful sites. One of the reasons this is a little bit content light for my typical reading group is that we have a superb resource online that doesn't need to be duplicated, which is the Anthony Powell Society webpage. And Keith Marshall is here as the member secretary, and he's actually going to join us in a couple of months to just talk specifically about the society. I can heartily recommend if you're fascinated by it. There's a lot of material online that's worth looking at, and if you become a member, they have a very nice journal that comes out that has articles about the dance, about Powell's work, about kind of the ecosystem of social and contexts and artistic contexts around Anthony Powell. A few good group guidelines. Just please, when you join, mute your audio. That avoids the video switching back and forth. If you'd like to speak, if you can use the little hand raise, or if you want to ask a question in the chat. The chat is nice because when I do the recording, I get a transcript of the chat is maintained. So if there's something you want to kind of keep, maybe it's something that's going to be discussed, or we'll get back to you later through email. That's a good way to deal with it. We're not all Anthony Powell. There are some people who are extremely versed on Anthony Powell, and there's some of us coming to it for the first time. So just if you're an expert, please don't bludgeon other participants with your expertise. And but neither be shy to admit that you have basic questions. For example, virtually all Americans will say, "Is it Powell or Powell?" So, and remember, these discussions will be recorded and posted in YouTube. So make sure this is stuff that your mom would be happy to see you taking part. Let's be respectful. These will be posted. I have a YouTube channel that I've used for other reading groups, as well as occasional videos that I put out about neglected books. My primary kind of presence on the internet is through the Neglected Books page, neglectedbooks.com, which is a website I've been running for almost 20 years now. And certainly poll, some people came back when I started soliciting interest in the poll in the dance reading group. There were folks who said, well, but that's not a neglected book. Well, frankly, there's a practical consideration I found. If I tried to run a reading group about books that have been long out of print, I would probably have about 2 or 3 people show up for an average discussion. So we have to go with the stuff that's available. Typical agenda, there'll be a little introduction. There may be presentation or guest remarks. I've been very lucky that a few poll experts will be joining us in the next few months. When I ran a reading group for Dorothy Richardson's Pilgrimage, we had lots of participation from Richardson scholars, which was absolutely fabulous. So I'm hoping down the road we can continue to line up folks to focus on a particular area about the dance, about pole, about the environment that the book takes place in, whatever might be the topic. After the introduction and remarks, I think we can have first impressions if you just want to go around, particularly for those who are coming into it for the first time. What did you think? What questions come up in the course of reading the book? And then we'll have an open discussion and then a wrap up. We'll try to end this on the hour, start and end on the hour, so that you can have a reliable and succinct discussion. So this time around, I'll start with just a little introduction. So Dance to the Music Time, it's a novel, and Pohl himself referred to it as a novel, not 12 novels, even though uh, each novel was written to be essentially a self-standing work that you could read separately, but it's much richer, and particularly the threads that we see in the connections and the interactions and the coincidental meetings of the characters come out much more broadly when you start to read it as a series. So it took him about 24 years to get 25 years to write and publish these. So it was fairly steady progression over the course of time. And Pohl himself said that he kind of, in most cases, got to a rhythm of work that really helped to keep to this. We should also bear in mind, this was a man who primarily made his living as a writer. So the income that came through publishing was essential. Just for the record, if you look in, I think it's Infants of the Spring, one of his memoirs, is where he explicitly, how do you refer to this? He especially mentions the kindly one, the 6th volume of my novel, A Dance to the Music of Time. So we can talk about the volumes and talk about the entire set of 12 as a novel. As I said, this is not an obscure book at all. There are lots of different editions out there. It's pretty much it's been continuously in print since it came out. And Heinemann, who was his first publisher, kept kept the same designer, kept the same fit and format. So there are, if you're interested in getting first edition sets, they're out there to be found. I will warn you, they can be a little bit dear. So here's one, a dealer in London there, Peter Harrington, who if you a book type in London, you've probably seen his presence
No,
repeated.
yeah, very good, very good.
I will
Peter Har
say that
Peter Harrington, no Peter
you can
Harrington
find
knows the
complete
price of
sets
everything.
perhaps in less choice editions. You can find complete sets down below $1,000, but that's kind of the ballpark. I mean, these particularly the later volumes, they sold quite well for literary fiction of the time, so they're not scarce, but to find a complete set can be a challenge. I thought this might be useful to kind of visualize the relative time frames of the 12 volumes, because even though it is takes place over a period of almost 50 years, or 50 years, uh, it is actually slices of time, and as you can quickly see from this picture, it does kind of concentrate primarily on the period between 1920 and the immediate post-war period, with the two subsequent volumes at the end, looking over a period of time. So we can imagine in this period of time, we're going to see deaths, people who Nicholas Jenkins knows as young people will fall by the wayside due to the course of time. But it's I think the other thing that I find kind of interesting that you get from this is that clustering of fairly short time frames right around the period just before the start of the Second World War and the first 2 years, full years of the war, because they were such intense. And when we get to those volumes, we'll see that that was a fairly, I mean, it was a significant moment, but also for Pohl himself. Of course, there are lots of parallels between Nicholas Jenkins' experience and Pohl's life, even though this is not an autobiographical novel by any stretch. Um, we can see the connections, particularly in that time frame. So did he plan it from the beginning? I find this an interesting question as a writer. When you start on a book, having just recently finished my first book, you think about where is this going? And what's interesting is that, yes, he did, you can see signs. And that's one of the things I think you benefit from reading this as a series. You quickly start to realize that any book you're seeing is part of a larger tapestry of the novel. So your first hint, if you read the question of upbringing, your first hint is right at the end of chapter 2, where we have this character Sonny Fairbrother, and Nicholas Jenkins' comment is, he passed out of my life for the next 20 years. We know right there that Pohl was expecting he would come back at some time. What's not clear is I'm not sure he necessarily had a deliberate 12 volume design up front. And I think one of the reasons we see the spacing of the last few volumes sort of reflects the struggle with, it's in fact the same thing Dorothy Richardson struggled with Pilgrimage, which is how do you end when it's a narrated novel? How do you end it if it's this kind of long period of time? It's a little bit awkward to end with the death of the narrator. There's also the sign, if you have gone through the novel at least once, you hopefully have picked up that he quite amazingly, in the very first words of the first book, creates a situation. Because if you read that, you first have to think, well, when is Jenkins seeing these men standing around this construction site by the roadside? Which is right there in the first words of the question of upbringing. Well, if you read through the end of the book, right towards the end of Hearing Secret Harmonies, the last volume, we discover where Jenkins is. And I find this fascinating because, as we kind of discussed, I mean, Hearing Secret Harmonies moves into the late 60s and 70s, and Pohl is writing this in 1950, 1951. He certainly had no idea necessarily But the fact that when he was writing the last volume, it gave him that opportunity to complete the circle, if you will, and bring us back and create a sense of a closure to the dance, so to speak. Um, and then finally, Heinemann themselves knew from the very beginning. So the material that they sent out to reviewers with the very first volume, to the review copies of the first volume, referred to it as the first of a series. Not explicitly 12 volumes, but certainly the fact that there were going to be more to follow. And with that, Keith, you've got your hand raised. So if you had something you wanted to add here.
Yeah, Brad, thanks. I was going to sort of start us off, if you like, with a little bit of personal experience and a couple of observations. One of which you've already started on. For those who are new to dance, which I know not all of you will be, because I can see a number of society members around. But those of you who are new to dance, don't feel afraid if you have found A Question of Upbringing slow. I found it very slow when I first read it, and I'm going back to 1983 or something now. Sufficiently slow, tedious, that I almost gave up. But I thought, no, I must try volume 2. By the end of A Buyer's Market, I was hooked. So, that's just a little bit of experience just to say, don't feel downhearted if you feel, that it's slow. The second thing I was going to say, Brad, was what you've already been talking about, and that's a series. Let's remember, Powell started off with the thought of probably writing 9 or 10 volumes. Yeah, and he found as he went on that it was going to have to expand to 12. Now, what are you going to do as an author when you're going to write a series like that? You've got to, in the first volume, and what Powell is doing, he is laying down a lot of hooks, which he may or may not pick up later. And there's a lot of them in The Question of Upbringing. Brad, you've talked about the workman. That is clearly one which could reappear. Most of them popping up in A Question of Upbringing appear at this point to be fairly inconsequential. They might be used later. Some are, many aren't. Paul himself is on record as saying that Commandant Leroy at La Grenadière, he had originally intended him to reappear during World War II in the French resistance. But he didn't, because it didn't suit his purpose to write about the French resistance. And we've got lots of other sort of potential hooks, mostly characters, but not only characters. And I'm not going to spoil the fun for you by telling you who reappears and who doesn't beyond Commandant Leroy. But we've got people like Short, Valkipar, who appears, the girl at the garage that Stringham gets the use of the phone from. Ina and Pauline in Templar's car crash. Bud, Moffat, Umfreville. You've talked, Brad, about Fairbrother. There's another one. You don't know, from what Paul says, whether he's going to reappear or not. Paul probably doesn't know when he writes it either. Yeah. And you've got the two French boys, Paul Marie and Jean Nepomucen. Yeah. I mean, And there are many more.
Right.
Almost anybody could reappear. So that's one thing again to keep in mind. Keep in the back of your mind that, and Powell is doing this all the way through
Right.
the volumes. You will find that there are names and people, mostly people, but not always, as we've seen with the workmen, incidents, places, incidents that can pop up and be
Right.
reused or not.
Right.
Um, the third thing I was going to say, and this is something which only struck me reading it this time, is just how dense A Question of Upbringing is. There is a lot in there, a lot more than many authors would put in there. Many authors would write, I don't know, 8 chapters, 9 chapters, and sort of have one major scene per chapter. Paul writes 4 chapters, but has got something of the order of 20 significant scenes in there. Yeah. You've got, chapter 1 alone, you've got a preamble and a bit about Widmerpool. That's 1. You've got Uncle Giles, 2, and then you've got Braddock alias Thorn. You've got 3 significant events just in the first chapter, and it's the same all the way through. Think about what's there, particularly at La Grenadière. There's a hell of a lot in that chapter. It's a big chapter, but there's a hell of a lot in it. And that's something which really only struck me, as I say, reading this time. Just how dense it is, because
Right.
especially having come, when I first read it, thought, this is a bit slow. There's not much, not really that interesting.
Yeah.
But when you
Yeah.
read it
Well,
again, there's an awful lot there.
I mean, this is a generalization, but many people reading fiction for the first time, of reading a work of fiction for the first time, read it for plot. And, you know, this is not a plot-rich book at the individual volume level. It becomes plot-rich in a life kind of framework, particularly because many of Pohl's plots sort of have an introduction and sort of a glimpse, and then something that comes back a
Mm.
book or 2 or 3 or 6 later, where you suddenly, okay, I see that narrative arc completing. I'm going to just go ahead and finish this introduction presentation, and then because I think we've got folks who are eager to go ahead and take part in the discussion. So just, for the record, the Dance of the Music of Time, he got the inspiration from Nicholas Poussin's painting, The Dance of the Music of Time. What I didn't know until I looked at Wikipedia was that it was painted for a future pope. This is available for viewing in the Wallace Collection in London. And of course, that happens. Jenkins looks at it in the course of the book. And there's been a lot of reading about how much is literally taken from the painting and reproduced in some form or not. But it's good to have as a point of reference. And it's certainly given the University of Chicago a great thing to do their illustrations for their series off of. Um, I just want to mention some of the supplemental reading that if you're really interested in it, to me, I always kind of like to know the context of a book. I find it tough to treat any work of art in isolation. I want to know the time it came from, the people who wrote it, or the people behind it, et cetera. So just some of the ones. Certainly a basic guide is Hilary Sperling's Invitation to the Dance, which first came out right after the series, the novel was finished, and has been reissued several times. It's available in several editions. I will say it's a little different from most introductory guides to a work of fiction that I'm familiar with, because it is 90% of the content is really an index of characters, references to books and paintings and places. And then right at the end, there's a relatively short synopsis, but it's a chapter level synopsis of each book. So it's great if you're trying to keep track of the time frame. It's a handy point of reference. And, it's also kind of the character entrance index is useful just to illustrate the fact that this sort of tapestry design. So here's the entry for Sonny Fairbrother, and when Jenkins says he disappeared from my life for the next 20 years, you can find out that okay, that was the 20s. So Fairbrother comes back in the context of the army in World War II. There are several biographies available about Pohl. Sperling wrote one. It benefits from the fact that by that time she was a friend of the Pohls and knew them fairly well, but also Michael Barber has one. It's a little shorter. Sperling's, would say, is the kind of a downside is once Pohl's done with the dance, she sort of rushes his life off the stage without further ado. Um, if you're looking for more of a critical guide, I can recommend Nicholas Burns's Understanding Anthony Powell, which is still in print from the University of South Carolina Press. And Nicholas will be joining us next month, which is a delight. Painting, of course, and art was hugely important to Powell, and as Sperling's book illustrates by the fact it's got a painting index, there are references. I mean, from the very first scene in actually the scene of the men around the brazier, he sort of imagines seeing that as a classical painting, but then he refers to Stringham and Templar and analogous to Renaissance art. So this is an interesting book. It's sort of a combination of replications of some of the works of art that are mentioned, but also some contemporary photos to give you a better sense of the time and place of the individual books. As soon as he finished the series, he got hot to work on his memoirs. So there are 4 volumes of his memoirs, as well as a 1-volume kind of combination of the memoirs that are out there to be read. And as soon as he finished with the memoirs, he started keeping a journal. And so that kept up for a period of about 10 years. And I would say it's nice to dip into the journals just to give you a sense of how large and diverse and interconnected Pohl's own social network was. Because there's not like an entry that's not about, I saw so and so, had lunch with so and so. And you start to realize, wow, there's a lot of similarities between Jenkins' world and Pohl's world, that this was a fairly, uh, it was a wide net, but it was a net that was fairly tightly connected. The series has been filmed once by BBC in the late 90s. Uh, a tough act to step up to because essentially we take a 2,000 page novel and condense it into 6 hours. So it's 4 hour-and-a-half episodes. Moderately successful, I would say, but interesting to see. There's also, if you like audiobook versions, there's an excellent unabridged audiobook version available from Audible and other sources, read by Simon Vance. There have been, I think, 2 radio adaptations. The one that people seem to prefer is the one from the late 70s, 90s to early 80s. These recordings are kind of floating out there. If you're interested, I have found them on various file sharing sources. So they're not that hard to get, but if you're not familiar with the file sharing world, it might be a little bit obscure. And just to mention, as I said, we're going to have a meeting the first Monday of each month. The next month, we'll be looking at a buyer's market, and we're very lucky to have a special guest of Nicholas Burns, the author of Understanding Anthony Powell, and is certainly one of the titans in the Powell world. And with that, I'm sure you're all happy to see that the presentation's at an end. And Jean, you had your hand raised, so I'll ask you to start off. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you. You've done it for me. Hello, Brad. I'm Jean Reed in very snowy Connecticut. And hello, Keith. Thank you very much for all that you said. Reminded me so much of what I was going to say, that having read The Dance for the second time many, many years ago, reading it for this group, and I'm so grateful to you, Brad, for bringing us all together. I've just been thrilled to know about it, and here I am. Having read so much in the meantime, Nick's book, of course, and Hilary Sprouling's books, and Lady Violet's, and the wonderful, many of us think the TV series was wonderful in many ways. All of that coming together in my mind as I was reading the first of the series for the over this last month, made that book mean so much more to me. Keith mentioned all the foreshadowing, the portending. Oh yes, very much so. And I certainly did not catch that either of the other two times. I'm sure. So I'm grateful to everyone's contribution, helping me enjoy this whole wonderful book, as you said he calls it, so very much.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jean. Mary, you've got your hand raised.
Yes, I wanted to say that, as Mr. Marshall said, I'd never read it before. And it was slow, but, I found it actually really compelling, so much so that I would think, oh, I'll only read a few pages, but then I would find that I had read 10 or 20 or 30. So yes, I became a convert.
Okay. Keith, you had something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to your point, Brad, of earlier about plots. And one of the things that is true, I think, of Dance is that it does not have a plot. And this is a criticism which has often been leveled at the series. There is no plot. There is no plot. And Powell himself explained this as basically what Jenkins is doing is telling a series of stories over the dinner table. And that's essentially what Powell is doing. And it is all a series of stories, the sort of thing you could, tell over the dinner table. And Powell, when he starts, he doesn't know where it's going to go. He himself said, and this will let a little bit of the cat out of the bag, he himself said, when I wrote Widmer, I suddenly found he took over, and and instead of being a character, he suddenly becomes a major character. And
Right.
and that, from the way Powell himself says that, and I can't remember where it is, I think it's probably in his journal somewhere. From the way he says that is something he had not expected, not intended, and shows that he really didn't know to a large extent quite where this series was going to go.
I find it a little hard to buy that about Widmerpool, because by the time you finish the chapter at La Grenadière, he's already dropped numerous hints that there's more to Widmerpool and that we'll find out more about him
Yeah,
later
yeah,
on.
yeah.
So to me,
I think the
it's
takeover may
it's hard to finish the first book without thinking we're going to hear a lot about Widmerpool. He's going to be, and in fact, one could argue, because Jenkins himself is such a passive character, you know, there's very little action that he takes. He's more of an observer in most cases, whereas Widmerpool is the, you know, he's the actor. He's got such, you know, he's the action figure. Maybe we should, somebody should launch a dance action figure series.
well, it's agents and patients again.
Okay. Yeah, you have the benefit.
If
I have to confess, I've not read Pohl's first novels prior to that. Got a couple of their hands. I think Chris was the first, so, and then Frank.
Thank you, Brad. My introduction to this book was just a few years ago during the pandemic, through the Rosenbach Library in Philadelphia. I took the online course, which was taught by Wesley Stace.
Right.
And it was a fantastic course. It really drew me into the book to the point where by the time I had finished the 12 volumes, I had joined the Pohl Society. I got all the supplemental books, and you know, I continued to keep up with it. So I was so glad to see that you had started this reading group, because I was like, oh God, I can't wait to reread this book again. And just rereading the first volume, Question of Upbringing, the second time through, I'm a lot more comfortable with it, because I don't have the handicap of having to keep in my head, who is this person? You know, should I think about them? You know, I'm like, oh, I know all these people already. So it's more fun to read the second time. But what a great book. And I'm really excited about reading it again.
I think just to tag on to that, I think one of the great things about going through this, I mean, there are other novels like that, certainly Proust, etc. But Pohl is that having, if you've read the whole series, you know, which is over, you know, 50 years plus, multiple lives, you know, it's a chance to essentially do what we don't get to do in real time in our real lives, which is to go back to the past and rerun them and say, now that I know this is coming in future, this activity here has nuances that I didn't have the first time around.
But I'll say one more thing. I have yet to meet anyone in the United States that I have spoken to that has ever heard of this book.
Really?
I've talked about this class, and what are you reading? And I say, I'm reading A Dance to the Music of Time. What is that? Who is Anthony Powell? I mean, I've gotten nothing.
Wow.
But I did get my brother involved because he was at a used bookstore and he said, oh, I see there's a 12-volume set of that Anthony Powell book. How much is it? I said, oh, it's like 35. I said, buy it and read it. So I'm hoping he comes to this class as well.
Right. I will mention just one last point, which is Wesley Stace will be joining us in April for discussion. So Wesley, who also in previous guys used to record as John Wesley Harding, will be joining us, and he's a Powell diehard as well. So Frank, and then Judith.
So this is the third time that I've read this, and I'd love to hear the experiences that mirror of what I had. First time, I didn't quite know what I was getting myself into, but as the series progressed, I enjoyed it. The second time, I felt very comfortable and sort of knew where things were going, and felt a little bit wise to what was going on. And I was a bit reluctant to read it the third time, thinking, I've had that experience of reading it before. It's just going to be the same. But no, on this third time, it feels like I've got more foresight in maybe the characters that aren't going to return. And so I'm paying close attention to them and to things like La Grenadière that maybe doesn't spoilers, progress to anything. Also, I love how it's just little 18 months of him at school. It doesn't cover the other parts of school and who were his best friends outside of Stringham and Templar. And I just think that's wonderful.
Yeah, yeah. I think I mean, you can see places where the parallel, and this is why I recommend, if you're interested in the series, I would certainly recommend probably Sperling's biography, simply because she had the cooperation of the subject. But that there are parallels, Pohl was the son of an army officer and not necessarily a distinguished army officer, so he kind of got scuttled around to postings as he could fit in a slot. And so I think the truth is that Jenkins and Pohl really didn't have a lot of childhood friends outside of people they knew from school. And that's one of the reasons I mean, I don't think you see any references to children Jenkins knew outside of school. I could be wrong on that, but let's jump in. I think Judith was next. If you want to.
Yeah, thank you. So you've just mentioned Proust. I came to this originally, I think maybe a couple of years before it was on television. And I think there was a piece on Channel 4 News saying that they were going to make this, and it was the English Proust. And I had studied Proust at university. I did a French degree, and so was intrigued from that way. And I can definitely, so I read, I think, the first 4 volumes, and then it was on TV. And I'll admit, I didn't go any further in the reading. I've just retired, so this is perfectly timed to read this. I can see coming back to it and knowing, I don't remember very much of the TV program, but a little bit, enough to know that, I can see that there are similarities, also clearly differences. I don't think the interesting thing about pace is that, again, comparison with Proust, it doesn't feel that slow to me. It just takes its time. It tells us what it wants to tell us. But the other thing that I've read subsequently that it seems to me must have been influenced, I don't know, but William Boyd's Any Human Heart, which I don't know if anybody else knows, and is a very different book, much shorter, but still has that lifelong account of the narrator, and again, somebody who's from a relatively well-off background. So I think it's kind of there's some interesting things there, and I think I suppose I think you made a comment, or there's something was said about him not being fashionable because of this very enclosed group of people that he's talking about. And it's really, they're quite aristocratic, they're well off, everybody's been to eat. And I think there's a kind of a way in which perhaps that sort of novel has in the UK a little bit fallen out of fashion. So I think it's really nice to be able to talk about something like this, which is just so beautifully written as well.
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons that Pohl, I think academics, particularly in the US, struggle with Pohl, in part because they can't quite decide, is he a modernist or a classicist? And that's, I think his prose in particular illustrates that. And that's kind of why I mentioned in my little short piece on A Question of Upbringing, is that he has some incredibly intricate sentences in the course of this book, and that's one of the reasons you don't tuck into it quickly and get wrapped up in the action of what's going on, is because Jenkins is constantly stopping and reflecting about something, or he's going, I mean, there are times when he describes simply somebody coming into a room and it goes on for 2 pages. Now I have to say, this is my 3rd time through it. What I found, I glossed over the first time through, and I really enjoyed now, were things like where he writes a little essay about people and about interactions. And I think that might be the difference between, I first read this when I was in university, and so now I'm in my 60s reading it again. I have lived a fair amount of life, And these things, that just, you see the importance of aspects that probably you gloss over when you're 20 something. I think next up, I'm just taking as I see the Gene, did you have? Could you unmute?
There it is. Thank you. If I may just make a quick comment. Something that occurred to me reading it this time is the age difference among those three boys that hadn't occurred to me before. And it's brought out many times in many places in this in the first book. And I don't think that I'd read anything about it. I don't think that I'd seen anything in the very, very, very active society email group, any comments or exploration about it. But it explains so much to me about Nick's position with his friends through the series, because although age difference, even places in class, I guess, in a school grade, I guess we would say in America, don't matter or shouldn't matter when people reach adulthood or even beyond in middle age. They are very, very important to young people. And Nick always, not necessarily, I'm not thinking of the right word, but isn't always deferential, but he's always respectful of their opinions, although he may not always agree. Anyway, on and on and on. That was a real revelation to me.
I think it's worth bearing in mind that, like Powell, particularly if you contrast Jenkins with Templer and Stringham, Templer and Stringham kind of come from established families with homes and addresses that stayed constant. And so in that way, Jenkins himself, as Powell was a bit of a lower, echelon in society because, his parents moved around and he was never quite sure where they were going to be. Versus I have a house in London, I have a house in the country. And I think that's one of the reasons why it was so important to Powell and his wife to get a place in the country that they could plunk down in and put their roots into, which is, I guess, it was the late 50s or late 40s that they bought the chantry. And that's where they stayed to the end.
If I may just respond to that again quickly, I hope. Yes, all of that is true, except that when he gets to Oxford, he's treated like someone who has background, has promise. Just think of who befriends him. Sillery, Short, he's taken into those groups. And
Right.
that occurred to me as well, that he's not of the moneyed class, perhaps, but there's something there that other people recognize in him.
Right.
And I don't know what it is, but he just we see him in Oxford and he's just moving right ahead.
Right. Let me go to, I think John has been waiting the longest. You'll just unmute.
There I am. I wanted to say that I have taught, some of you probably know, I have taught Dance to the Music of Time at Phillips Academy, Andover, twice when I was teaching there. And the result has been this book, which is called Dance Class. And there's Woodmerpool right there. And I worked through the entire series twice with high school students. And what I wanted to say in reference to A Question of Upbringing is that I was extremely, because I'd read the whole series a couple of times, that they were infuriated by the treatment that Widmerpool received at Eton. And I had been blind to that because I read the first book in a day and I read the first 9 books in 9 straight days. So I raced right through it and I got to see Kenneth in his later years. But I went back and looked and they are just obnoxious to him.
Yeah.
And
One thing that struck me, because the overcoat for our time, and particularly as Americans, we don't know the nuances of tailoring and things like that. But if you were to take it and substitute athletic shoes, or trainers as they're called in the UK, and say, oh, Widmerpool came in wearing the wrong brand or an off brand of trainers, because high schoolers are ruthless about picking out what makes you accepted and what makes you unaccepted. And so, yeah, when I read that again the last time, or this time, yeah, the overcoat's like, what I mean, to single that out, and it's kind of a funny thing because Jenkins kind of goes over he spends a couple of, detailing. I'm not sure if it was whether it had a belt or it had this, that, and but the overcoat, it was the wrong overcoat.
yeah. Yeah.
Paula, I think you're next. If you'll unmute. There we go.
This is my 3rd time reading it. Once about 15 years ago, and once more recently taking Wes Stace's class, where we read a book a month and discussed it, which was excellent. And then I joined the society. This time around, I was noticing in Upbringing, when I first read it, I was just without other experience of the series, the book. I noticed I was expecting it to be one of those books about boys at school in England who pull pranks but generally turn out to be the right kind of man to run our forces in India or whatever.
Right.
But that was based on, and I see such an interesting comparison. There's a book by Kipling called Stocky and Company.
Right.
I read it in my teens and loved because it was all English and so forth. And it was Kipling based apparently on his own experience at the United Services College, where he figures as one of those figures, just as Paul figures as one of the threesome of boys. So that book, Stocky and Company, was published in 1899, which of course is very Victorian and very all that period. And Paul wrote in 1951. And then I realized to my surprise that he's a lot closer in time there's 50 years between those pub dates, whereas there's 75 years between us and A Question of Upbringing in 1951. Right. So they are both about 3 friends, rebellious and apt to make fun of their masters and pull tricks on other people. And in each one, in Kipling, the 3, I just learned because I looked it up, the 3 figures are based on 3 people, one of them being Kipling himself. And in Poe, A Question of Upbringing, of course, there are 3 friend figures, leaving aside Widmerpool, who are also supposed to be, so we read, based on people he knew, including Jenkins being based on Powell. So I have the question, I want to make that observation, which surprised me, but also to know, is there anything in the memoirs or the critical works about any inspiration? I know that there were a lot of that kind of book in that period, apparently inspired by Kipling's Stocky and Company. So I just wondered if other people observed that or noticed it in the literature.
Okay. Anyone want to respond to that?
Yeah, I'm not aware that there's any particular influence Powell had from anybody. I mean, he is so well read that he's pulled influence from all over the place. I don't think there's any particular one. I'm not aware of anyway. I mean, others may disagree with me. Other people have probably, read through, the memoirs and the journals more recently than I have, but I'm not aware of anything.
I think also whenever you deal with the public school, you have to go back to Tom Brown's school days.
Yeah.
Which is sort of like
actually the one that possibly did influence Powell was Gatsby.
Yeah.
Scott Fitzgerald. Because he spent 6 months in Hollywood and met Fitzgerald, and I think Gatsby is if there is an influence, I suspect it's that. Can I pick up on just 3 quick other points, Brad, and
Sure.
just sort of fill in things other people have been saying? In terms of school friends, the only one I can think of that Powell ever sort of kept on with was Henry Green, the author, who he met at prep school and remained a friend through university. Certainly, I think they probably, to a large extent, lost touch, in the sort of late 20s, 30s. But certainly, he's the only one I can think of that Powell mentions. And yes, his father did get moved around. He never knew where his parents were going to be. I mean, Lady Violet actually said that he saw Eton basically was the calming influence. It was home. It was static, and that was important to him.
Right.
Because he's I mean, during World War One, having looked at where he lived, he moves around continually with his mother around London, friends, and I suspect out of London, staying with friends, relatives, boarding houses, here, there, and I asked Lady Violet about this at one point, and she said, we don't know where he lived. He probably wouldn't even have remembered. This was just after he died. He wouldn't have he probably couldn't even remember himself. He wouldn't have known.
Leslie, you had your hand raised. If it's okay, Keith.
Yeah.
Oops,
sorry.
there we go.
Am I unmuted?
No,
I was going to say there's this whole genre of school stories, of which Kipling is actually a very subversive one. Storky and Co. are not like the Fifth Form at St Dominic's or Tom Brown. They're kind of drinking and smoking, and even if they're eventually going out to rule the empire. Though when I think of the people they were actually based on. One of them, George Beresford, who McTurk was based on, went out to India to be, I think, an engineer, took one look, turned round, came back, became a famed photographer and an member of the aesthetic set. So I wrote his ODMB entry, so anyone wants to go and look that up, please do. But I was going to say that what Powell is doing here is the Eton section is very much writing against. I think he's very much subverting the whole school story thing, the spirit of the school, play up and play the game. There is nothing of that. There is nothing of the, fading light and the last man in, all that kind of thing. They're all kind of being very decadent about it. There is the whole, Templar going to town and having a woman, shock, horror. There is a bit of a mention also of a homoerotic thing going on, though by the time Powell's writing, this is 30 years after Alec was the Loom of Youth, which first introduced that kind of theme. So I think he is actually writing with a sense of there was that literature there, and he is writing against it, as it were. He is aware that there is that whole genre of public school literature, and he is, as it were, not having anything to do with the usual tropes.
Right, yeah. I agree. And also let's bear in mind the time frame, because this is right after World War. And
I was going to say
they're the generation of young men who missed the war.
And I was going to say there is a sense that they are not going out to rule the empire. They are getting nice jobs in the city and going to make a lot of money. It's a different mindset.
Sally, you have your hand raised. If we can get your comment or question.
Yes. What I was struck by in rereading this, A Question of Upbringing, was this the concept of time, and that a brief a second of time leads to an infinity or an epoch, a change of epoch. And I noticed that, for example, with the four workmen around the fire, a snowflake hits the flame, and that leads him to an infinite memories of ancient times that are infinite. And that sort of starts that foreshadowing of time. And the one that really struck me was at the end of A Question of Upbringing, when he goes to see, Nick goes to see Stringham in London, and Stringham cuts his date. He just, they're together. He goes, let's get out of here. Well, Nick goes, I'm a bit late. We'll have a drink, but where shall we go? And then where should we make for? And for a brief second, for an inexpressibly curtailed efflux of time, so short that its duration could be appreciated only in recollection, Stringham was embarrassed. And Stringham says, I'm cutting your date, and right before your eyes in slow motion. And that's when Nick realizes that that's the end of an epoch. That's the end of their friendship. He even says a few pages later that a new epoch was opening. In a sense, this night was the final remnant of life at school. Right. And I just find that the way that Powell uses the briefest second to change life into an epoch, or I don't know. That was my observation.
No, I think that's a great, because that's a great example of that's a realization that wouldn't have happened. I mean, it wasn't happening in real time at that instant, but in reflection, he sees that moment as a breaking point. And we see these in our own lives, so looking back on it, I now see, etc. Let's get hear from Rosemary, and then we'll wrap it up for this month's discussion. Wonderful participation, everybody.
Hello. I'm afraid my lighting's rather poor. Nobody has mentioned the humor, and I started reading these 40 years ago. I've read several times, but reading this one for the get together, I found particularly the French chapter really so funny. Madame Dubisson dressed for shopping in Paris, but sitting knitting in the summer house. So I wondered if other people have been amused, or whether the humor rather gets lost.
Anyone want to chime in?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, there's humor all the way through Dance. Going back to the older Simon Vance narrated Audible books, I found listening to them, I got a lot more of the humor coming through than actually in print. There's a lot there, and Vance brings it out very well.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is for me, it's not humor, ha ha. I mean, in fact, I started Powell because I loved Evelyn Waugh's books, and I thought, oh well, he's the same kind of time frame. He's not, you don't have I don't find you have the laugh. He's not a belly laugh kind of writer. He's not which is one of the reasons I think he has legs over the course of time, is that jokes tend not to stand up that well over the course of time, particularly over being retold. But you start, and I'd also have to say, at 60, I find some of these things, knowing how quirky people are, how everybody's got their peculiarities and their biases, etc. I pick up on what I call the human comedy of the story much more. So Frank, you wanted to add something?
I think the humor feels like a shared story. It's almost nostalgic. So it's like talking to a friend and saying, "Do you remember that time when we rung up the police and we said that our teacher was a criminal? Oh, that was amazing. I can't believe he never found out it was us." That's the sort of feeling you get when you read it. It's warm, it's friendly, and it's like companionable, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I mean, like Uncle Giles is throughout, until his demise, is a comic figure because he is such an odd guy. And Nicholas never really understands who this character is and why he is the way he is, because he's always so, we'd say in America, he's a very squirrely character. He always sort of disguises where he's going and what he's doing, and he doesn't want to talk about anything so particular. That's funny. He's always showing up with something fairly unexpected.
But why does he think that Nick can do anything for him? Nick's a child, and he's going around and causing trouble for him, and feeling like Nick's gonna sort out the money situation.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, let's wrap it up because we are past the hour. Thank you all for taking part. I hope it's been an enjoyable discussion. Next month we'll be talking about the next book, A Buyer's Market, and we'll have Nicholas Burns, who's an amazing expert on Powell. If you do get a copy of his book, it is not just about the dance; it's really about all of Powell's work, and quite astonishingly, he even goes into the details of an analysis and looking at the journals, not just the previous novels and the dance, but the memoirs and the journals. It's really the whole of Powell's oeuvre, if you will, that Nicholas looks at. So unless there are any other comments, thank you so much for joining. I will email out a link to the video when it's online, and I look forward to this journey with everyone.